My name is George Stavros. I'm the Executive Director of the Danielson Institute, and it's my pleasure to introduce each of the speakers and panelists for the final portion of our afternoon together. The format for the rest of the program is that we have 4 panelists who will each come up and do a short presentation. After they've all completed their presentations, the 4 of them will sit together and spend some time dialoguing about what each of them has presented, and then we'll open it up to the audience to close out the afternoon. So it'll be a good all-around interactive experience for us, because my sense is there are a lot of thoughts and feelings bouncing around the room right now that will come to the surface. So our first panelist is Dr. Kermit Anthony Crawford. He is a licensed psychologist, designated forensic psychologist. Several of us from the Danielson Institute were the beneficiaries of his and Dr. Shamila Khan's hospitality down at the Center for Multicultural Mental Health at Boston University Medical Center, one of the most unique training programs in the country. He is an associate professor in the Division of Psychiatry at the Boston University School of Medicine, has expertise in mental health, psychology training, substance abuse, workforce development, and extensive experience in disaster behavioral response and mental health training, something that he truly is nationally known for and called upon to do in some of the more high-profile and high-intensity disaster situations our country has known, from Hurricane Katrina to 9/11 to the Boston Marathon bombings. Dr. Crawford usually is called upon to be there. He has facilitated and provided these behavioral health response services and training across the nation. He's done that in concert with SAMHSA and with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. He has spoken far and wide and been a resource to all kinds of agencies that have required response to disasters. His career is committed to spanning cultures and to providing equitable mental health and behavioral health services to diverse, underserved populations. It is a great pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Kermit Crawford.
Thank you for that great introduction. Good afternoon. Now look, okay, Dr. Helms, didn't you talk to these people? Where you at, Dr. Helms? Y'all might not get it from my accent. I'm not from Boston. And I am a black male of Southern African American heritage. So when I say good afternoon, I also expect like good morning. So let's try it again, just like Dr. Helms showed y'all how to do that this morning. And we're gonna pretend like nothing happened, okay? Good afternoon. Thank y'all, thank you. Sometimes I often wonder if I got a PhD just to try and figure out what I can't figure out that I will never figure out. And I like to think that I would be better than that over the course of time, but it still doesn't quite work that way because we all talk about evidence-based practice, the EBPs. But the reality is that very little that we do in the behavioral sciences is evidence-based. And almost none, because we talk about an error factor that's always there that seems to account for most of the variance associated with behavior. So at best, we usually get to maybe evidence-informed. Some things are evidence-supported. The difference being if it's evidence-informed, it's usually replicatable or documentable. If it's replicable, then we get to evidence-supported. And if it's validated, we get to evidence-based. So I don't want to sound like I'm a naysayer, but I just wanted to sort of repeat something that Dr. Vanderkoot mentioned, which is that his words were, we often pretend that we know more than we do. Because in many things we do, we're still trying to just figure it out. So I say that in the spirit of figuring it out today, kind of like making it up as I go. I had the privilege and awesome responsibility to direct the behavioral health response for 9/11 at Logan Airport. And in that way, I began to really understand that much of the technology we have, many of the tools that we have, don't work when it comes down to responding to people in the midst of trauma related to disaster. So we had to develop some new things along the way, and I'll talk briefly about that because I only have about 8 minutes left in this section. We might be able to ferret it out a little bit more. And Dr. Sandard said at the beginning he wanted original and courageous thinking. So I am going to be original and courageous as I think through this presentation. I might even be confused along the way, I don't know. But do the dates, Tuesday, January 12th, 2010, and Friday, March 11th, 2011 mean anything to anybody here? Well, you know those dates, at least what happened big on those dates. Because one was the Haiti earthquake in 2010, and the other was the Japanese earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown about that time, but it was in 2011. And I bring that up because this was part of the picture that was associated with Japan in the tsunami. And if you think about Haiti, this was part of what was going on with Haiti. Now, after the disasters occurred, this was about a year in one of the prefectures, one of the counties in Japan. You can see on the left is right after the tsunami, and on the right, a little over a year after, everything's pretty much cleaned up, although a lot of it's still barren. And then you look at Haiti, and then the top picture is right after the 2010 earthquake, and the picture below is the same area about 3 years later, which is kind of amazing, and Dr. Carr may talk a little bit about her experience there. But what is amazing about this is that if you think about the two countries juxtaposed with each other, in Haiti, between 260,000 and 319,000 estimated to have died in the earthquake, 3 million displaced. In Japan, a little over 15,000 confirmed dead, 19,000 suspected of being dead, many are still missing, and about 300,000 people displaced. But the differences are pretty stark because the research says that in Haiti, in the aftermath, there has been a great amount of desperation, as it was defined, and depression, and suicidal ideation. But there was no documented significant increase in suicidality. Whereas in Japan, in some areas, there was as much as a 39% increase in suicidality, especially among folks who were unemployed, especially were among the elderly, and among people who continue with hardship. So I began to wonder about what is the difference? What accounts for that? Because it seems like this would be a whole lot easier to handle than this. This notion of resilience, and I'm going to generally define resilience, as an ability to recover quickly from an illness, change, or misfortune. And resilience, to me, is a variable that really has a mediating variable, one that explains the relationship between trauma on one end and recovery on the other end. It has a direct effect on the outcome in that regard. And another term that I think about, well, this is a little more on resilience. When something happens over time, anxiety and stress, resilience sort of carries us there. Resilience is built in. It's a God-given gift. We all pretty much have it just by being human. And that's a very good thing. We can usually count on it being there. In the aftermath of disaster, most people don't need any type of mental health services. In fact, most people don't seek mental health services. In Louisiana, I was asked to come down and do an evaluation because the Baton Rouge Area Foundation, with a number of other foundations, had collected $55 million to provide unlimited services to mental health services to individuals that need it, mental health, behavioral health, mental health and substance abuse. And then after 2 years, and they had estimated between 7,000 and 10,000 individuals needing long-term psychotherapy. After 2 years, they had 110 people. So they've got to account to all these other foundations why they only had 110, and they asked me and my team could come down to help them figure out why. And what we figured out was not that so many people won't need the services, because there was utter devastation in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. I should have mentioned that, Hurricane Katrina. But the reality is that when we had done previously an evaluation across the state of human services workers, they said unanimously, I got to get my family together, I got to get my home together, I got to get employed, I'll have my mental breakdown later. Healthy people who are going through this. So resilience is a big part of what happens after a disaster, and I don't think it's given enough attention. And I don't think it's given enough study to try to understand this magical gift that we're given simply as a condition of being human. And then there's the other part, which is culture. It's been mentioned several times today, but a shared set of values, beliefs, behaviors, attitudes, and attributes, institutions, and all products of human thought and works. So if I put those two things together, how many of you are familiar with this? What is it? Y'all can read this. The hierarchy of needs. Where'd it come from? What was his first name? What was his middle name? What? Okay, that was his middle name, beats me. His middle name was Harry. But is this really Maslow's hierarchy? When did Abraham Harry Maslow die? 1970. In 1970. Those of us who were in school in 1970, what was the top level? Self-actualization. Now, if you think about it, as human beings, we kind of start from the bottom and we sort of work our ways up through the hierarchy. And conceptually, I understand what this means. And I just adore the concepts. I really do, and the theory behind it. But it seems to me that when a person gets to transcendence, they just get all puffed up and get full of themselves and just go poof, and you never see them again. But conceptually, we all want to move up this particular ladder. So resilience carries us through this from the bottom up automatically. It helps get us there, unless something gets in the way. For most of us, not everyone, I want to caution. I'm not talking about those few people or percentages that need behavioral health services in the aftermath. I'm talking about most people like us, just normal people trying to do the best we can. Normal people responding to a very abnormal situation. What I propose is to think about it as a culture of resilience. That we often think about working with individuals one-on-one in the aftermath of trauma, of terror, in the aftermath. Some we work with them on faith, others we work with them through cognitive behavioral or other supportive services, including groups. But oftentimes it is reactive as opposed to being proactive. So the proactive part of this is that I think what I would propose is that we look at Maslow's hierarchy and understand that we are building a base to be able to sustain as individuals go up this pyramid. An example of why that's going to be important is that if you look at the Industrial Revolution in our country, there's a parallel line of suicide increases with the Industrial Revolution. You look at South Korea, you look at Lithuania, you look at a number of other countries as they industrialized, then you'll see that same increase in suicidality. Now, if that is an index of the stress that people are under and some other things that are happening, then what do we need to do to address it? And you look at the Haiti situation, and my hypothesis, this is only conjecture, and conjecture is opinion that is not necessarily substantiated by evidence. So please just understand, I know the difference, okay? But in my conjecture, which is also based on incomplete evidence, I'll face it, sometimes I'm just trying to know what I can't know that I won't know, okay, is that the further we get up this hierarchy, the further we get away from those things that are truly beneficial to us innately in the aftermath of trauma and disaster. So if we build a culture of resilience, the culture of resilience is based on physiological needs, safety needs, belongingness, a sense of connected to natural helping systems. And then those other things that we do up, we move on with our society, but we don't lose touch with those other parts that are difficult to get back to, as in the example of Japan, that many of the people in Haiti remained in contact with. This is these are the psychosocial phases of recovery. And this is Zunin and Myers, 2001. They did a mega analysis of many different studies to see how people go through the recovery cycle to get back to being okay. And there's a part of me that feels that this curve, which the amplitude cannot be relied, it's not reliable, the amplitude. The timeline is not reliable. We found after the Merle Federal Office Building explosion in 1995 that we're not just looking at a timeline of 1 to 3 days to 3 years. We're looking at a timeline to really see things maybe 5 to 7 years down the line. We saw that again in the aftermath of the World Trade Center collapse, terrorist attack and collapse. But what we see is that as we come to terms, if we have a culture of resilience, then this curve, this graph, flattens out a lot for most people, as opposed to the kind of wild variations that are in there. So my proposal and the bottom line is that as we think about all the things that we do in response, and this does not deal with the folks who need the long-term help, who need the intensive psychotherapy, or the EMDR, or the CBT, whatever it might be. This is for what I propose is for most of us, in terms of those that are normal people dealing with abnormal situations, and how we go about establishing and inoculating a context in our culture to be able to sustain the traumas that we will inevitably have to address. It's not a matter for most of what I do of if, but it is a matter of when. And I want to make sure, as I work with folks, that we do all that we can to make what they need priority, and to do what we need to do to make sure that they don't have to suffer, individuals don't have to suffer so much before they get back to being just who they are, which are the normal people dealing with a very abnormal situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Crawford. Dr. Shubaila Khan is the clinical director of the Disaster Behavioral Health Program and clinical faculty at the Center for Multicultural Mental Health at Boston Medical Center. Her specialty training is trauma, individual, group, or community-based, disaster-related, immigration, and post-colonial. More specifically, her clinical experience and expertise entail trauma and disaster relief work at all levels. As a trainer and first responder with a multicultural focus in varying contexts, nationally and internationally, including work within the United States VA system, NYU Bellevue Hospital, Cambridge Health Alliance, Harvard Medical School here locally. The FEMA program in Pakistan following the major earthquake in 2005. As a Muslim mental health professional at varying mosques in New York City after 9/11. With the Japanese population, as we saw after the tsunami. In Haiti, after the earthquake there. She also did the Danielson Institute a great favor by coming and providing us some training on some connections between the Quran and psychotherapy that was unlike anything we'd ever heard before, and we hope she'll come do a reprise of that with us. She has additionally provided trauma-based services, working with varying vulnerable populations, including women who have endured domestic violence, physically and sexually abused children, developmentally disabled adults, individuals diagnosed with autism, Down syndrome, and with deaf and hard of hearing individuals. If there's trouble, if there's disaster, you want Dr. Shamaila Khan around.
Good afternoon. I want as loud a response as Dr. Crawford and Dr. Helms. So good afternoon. So I'm also going to try to be a little bit bold and courageous. So I had a presentation prepared that was pretty structured. And I know that there's safety in structure, but as I was listening to the presenters, I decided that I want to throw that structure out. I was inspired in terms of what I was hearing, and I thought I could bring all the different aspects of what I was hearing together in my own personal story. So I thought I would share my personal trajectory and sort of relate it to how it plays out in my professional work. So if it seems a little fluid and not as organized, please bear along. So as I was hearing Dr. Sandage talk about trauma, diversity, and spirituality being discrete topics, the part that excites me is bringing different topics together and interdisciplinary work. Anything that brings different ways of thinking together, crossing borders really, is what excites me. And I've recognized over time as to why that is. It's because in my own personal history, I've crossed multiple borders. So that's sort of naturally, instinctively appealing. I was born and raised in 3 different continents, speak 7 different languages. So the idea of trauma and dissociation, multiple states and ways of being, all of that spectrum, on that being on a spectrum is also very appealing. So I thought I would talk a little bit about that. As I was hearing Dr. Helms talk about identity development, I was reflecting in that moment on my own identity and as to how I came to be. So I was born in Pakistan, lived there for 2 years, and then moved to Libya. Lived there for 11 years, moved back to Pakistan for a few years, then moved to upstate New York, and then moved to New York City. Lots of transitions. As I was transitioning between all these spaces, I was becoming very attuned to who I was within these different settings. Who I was as a person, what my identity was. Initially, as a child, is an attempt to fit in and belong, because you want to fit in and belong at that time, but I became very attuned to my surroundings. As I shifted between these spaces, things were changing in major ways. The language I was speaking, the way I was dressing, the foods I was tasting, the climates, everything shifted. And I realized when I was in Pakistan, the only idea of identity that I had primarily was that of initially an ethnic identity. I defined myself as a Pakistani, and the conversation that was very prevalent in that world was, you're not an Indian, so you're a Pakistani. So the ethnic part of my identity was very much prevalent in my mind, and I thought, I'm a Pakistani because I'm not an Indian. You define yourself as to who you're not at that early stage. Then I shifted to Libya. And all the Southeast Asians, meaning Indians, Pakistanis, and Bengalis, lived together in one area, and they were all one. All of a sudden, that who was the other of an Indian was one of us, and the other became those of the Libyans. And I felt like, okay, so I am now a Southeast Asian, and the other is that of Libya. And then the US attacked Libya at one point. and all of my feelings about being with the Libyans were evoked, and the US was the other. So all of a sudden, I was a Southeast Asian Libyan, all of which could be combined as a sense of being a Muslim, because we're all Muslims in lots of ways. So I realized, okay, now I'm much more aware of my identity as being a little bit more complex. Now I was also starting to recognize that being a Muslim in Pakistan was very different than being a Muslim in Libya and what that entailed. So the diversity within the religious aspect of my identity was becoming very apparent. Now, when we moved from Libya to the US, I moved to upstate New York, where in school I was the only person of color. And I became very aware and attuned to the racial aspect of my identity. We were noticeable as being different. I didn't recognize that I was of a different color living in Pakistan. We're all the same color. In Libya, it was pretty much along the same lines. I became very attuned to my color and racial identity. So I was starting to put all of these aspects of my identity together and figure out who I really am. And what are the different aspects of my identity that get evoked in each setting? I also recognized when I came to the US, that lots of things that I couldn't do as a woman is what I could do here, and all the women do those things. So the gender aspect of my identity started to become highlighted. So all these complex ways in which I was starting to understand, make sense of who I was. And I realized in every setting, I was different and the other. And over time, I became comfortable with being the outsider. I think I'm comfortable being in between spaces and not belonging to either one setting. And that is something that really plays out in my theoretical understanding in terms of how I do my work professionally. So I also recognized that there was this whole post-colonial idea. It came to my mind because when I was in Pakistan, this idea of coloring your skin, bleaching, was very common. You go to all these beauty parlors and this notion of bleaching, and we all did this as if it was nothing odd. And I thought about it, reflected more and more on all these ways in which Southeast Asia, which was colonized by the British, and the idea of the other being better, and how we wanted to be like the colonial ruler, the oppressor rather than the oppressed, and how we play that out in our ways of being, and we don't even think about it. So I became very tuned and interested in that aspect. Being that I was so interested in identity, it naturally led me to follow a career in psychology. And as I started, I went to a psychoanalytic institution at Delphi University, very interested in psychodynamic theory, and I entered with a lot of excitement and realized slowly that lots of things that I was asking were very odd and different. I remember the first class about Freud and the dreams. It was about the unconscious wishes. It's like, what? Unconscious wishes, really? I understand dreams to be about the future. My mother has books and books of dreams that are about what future is, about all these symbols that represent future. And I would question and ask, well, what about dreams about being the future? And there was no room to sort of accommodate that. And I remember challenging and being always outside again. And every paper that I would write, I would combine all these different ideas together. So my paper on dreams incorporated unconscious wishes and interpretation of a dream that had that part, but it also had the other part of it, including symbols and citing those parts. So I was always crossing borders again and combining different worlds. And then I remember reading about the id, ego, and the superego. And reading the Quran and having learned about religion, it was very familiar. We have this notion in Islam about nafs, qalb, and the ruh. And if you look at the definition, it defines almost literally into id, ego, and superego. And I was like, wow, this is something that came before psychology and Freud came along. So all of a sudden I started talking about that. So my papers, I would combine those parts with these parts. So I felt like I was always outside in some realm and wanting to combine different worlds. And I continued to do that, and part of my dissertation challenged that, the psychoanalytic realm was very informative, very helpful, but very limiting. And there was no conversation about multiculturalism or diversity or other ways of thinking. And I challenged things in lots of ways, and being comfortable doing that after a while. Initially, naively so, but I learned how to politically frame it in a different way along the way. So I did a dissertation that was naturally about identity, but I wanted it to be outside the psychoanalytic realm as well. So I had people involved from the sociology department or the art department. Also, I realized that I was shifting between languages a lot. I was already providing therapy in 4 different languages at that moment, and that I was a different being each time. It wasn't just a shift in the language, but a shift in the way I was, how I related. This is also post-reflection. I wasn't as aware of it at that time, but how close I sat to somebody, whether I made eye contact or not, all those things changed. And I became more and more attuned to that. And I started to mix words in papers and languages. And this sort of hybridity, the notion of hybridity was very appealing to me. And the universal language for me became art. I became an artist in that moment. I created a lot of artwork, and I started putting images together that were not seen together. Or, for instance, a woman who's veiled or covered, who's revealing in her body parts things that would perplex people and would sort of generate questions, crossing borders again. And that became just my way of being. And I think it has lent itself to some interesting work professionally. I remember, since it was not an easy conversation within the school to bring up these things, I became very involved in Psychoanalytic Community Division 39. I became very proactive in talking about multicultural issues there. Every time I go to the conference, literally for 4 years in a row. My last name is Khan, and I would go to the conference. My ID badge would be there, and it would be spelled Kahn. And I would ask about it each time. So the last presentation I did last year, I went there, I took all my IDs, and I kept putting them on one after another, and talked about how I get defined before I get to define myself, and what that experience was like, and how often we tend to do that without realizing these things. I also thought of including some of this. I think you're talking about the body aspect, including that, and what the Sufis do, and what the whirling dervishes, and how you bring in the body aspect. How do you bring in the mind? When we look at people and we're thinking of people as associated with trauma and dissociation, we're looking at their cognitive ways of being, their emotional ways of being, their physical ways of being, and which parts are dissociated and left out. When I do a lot of trauma work, and I have people that I work with who can easily talk about their experiences, maybe factually, but not have the emotional association with that, or others who can be in an emotional aroused state, but cannot really have a conversation, or people who feel it in their bodies, but cannot relate it to their other experiences. So how do you bring all these aspects together? So this idea of being in different mental states is really appealing, and it plays out in my work in varying ways. Thinking of the ways in which since I've done work in after 9/11, working in the mosques, lots of people, we have provided mental health services. Nobody was coming to seek mental health services from that community. We recognized we had to go to those settings to provide those services. And what did those services look like? It's very similar to the services that I'm providing right now at the Islamic Center, the Boston Cultural Center. After the Boston Marathon bombings, people were not coming to seek services from within that community. So we go there and we have conversations there. And these conversations, they're therapy sessions as well, but they're very different. We talk about the prayers. Now, the Quran is supposed to have all the answers as a Muslim believer. So people look within that to find the answer. So a lot of the conversation is about what you find in there. What are the surahs saying? What did the Prophet do about in such a situation? How do you incorporate that with how we think clinically? So combining those two has been a big part of the work. I just came back from Haiti 2 months back, and that was very interesting work. I was working with the Muslim population within Haiti that was traumatized and who cannot talk about their psychological issues. It's all somatic symptoms. So how do you bring all these different aspects? Now, there's a cultural factor of being an Haitian, identity of a Muslim individual within that setting, and then you have these physical symptoms. So it's very interesting to bring all those things together for me. I'll share a couple of more. There is this, I've had patients that I've worked with who are refugees. Lots of them are refugees, and wanting to work with people who would understand their cultural, religious backgrounds. And I've done lots of things that are very different and outside and crosses the border of what Eurocentric way of clinical treatment may be, which includes having done the prayers with them in the room, in the office, or reading the surah with them, or looking at the Quran for an answer. And combining that with my way of understanding that's different. But I can give them that and they can hear what I have to say if I can hear what they have to say. So it's been very interesting in that regard. The last thing maybe I'll mention is that there's this whole concept of jinn, which is a jinn is a possession of a spirit. So I've seen a lot of that in my work with a lot of refugee women. And what I've started to realize is that this idea of a jinn is very similar to what we talk about in regards to people who are traumatized, whose identity is dissociated, DID. They take on this personality, you're a bit possessed by a jinn, so the jinn is taking over your body and you're going to react and engage in these ways which you have no control over. And it's a very common phenomenon and known phenomenon, and it's exactly what DID is about. So how do I think of that while incorporating their way of thinking, and what is their treatment, which is Raqwa? So how do I incorporate that way of treatment that includes my way of treating them at the same time? So again, it's about crossing those borders and combining these different worlds. I have many more examples, but I'm sure I'm out of 10 minutes, so I'll just stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Khan. Dr. Shelley Rambo is Associate Professor of Theology at Boston University School of Theology, where she is highly valued and respected by her colleagues and very sought after and popular amongst the student body. Her research and teaching interests focus on religious responses to suffering, trauma, and violence. Her book, Spirit and Trauma, A Theology of Remaining, provides a way of rethinking Christian claims about God's presence and absence in suffering through engagement with contemporary trauma theory, a very novel and unique approach to these questions, and interdisciplinary. Through partnerships with military chaplains and veteran care groups, she's exploring the religious implications of American military involvement and the challenges of trauma healing. Her current research explores the significance of resurrection wounds in the Christian tradition in connection to contemporary discourses about wounding, both in popular culture and in the study of trauma. Through a series of faculty grants funded by the Center for Practical Theology at Boston University School of Theology and the Lilly Endowment, she has developed and presented workshops that offer religious leaders critical tools for thinking theologically about trauma. Dr. Rambo.
Okay, I'll just start talking before the PowerPoint comes up. Thank you, George and Steve, for inviting me to be part of this conference I've been attending. I attended last year when Ken Pargament gave his presentation, and have really been influenced by the students who come through the Danielson Institute as well as my colleagues. So I teach a course every third semester. It's too tough to teach it every year, called Theology and Trauma. And one of the first things that I do is I throw up neurobiology slides. So they get a good dose of Bessel van der Kolk and my really elementary work on the hippocampus and amygdala, of which I was trained about none of that in theological training. But also then from there, which really challenges theological traditions that are very wedded to sacred texts and narratives, very word-based. And then the rest of the semester is really moving students through what I call a kind of boot camp of the religious claims of their traditions. which is the basic questions that I think are not just theological questions, but are existential questions. Who are we as human beings? Where is God in the suffering? Still the most kind of classic question I hear from military chaplains. That's the biggie. And then to think of who are we to be in the aftermath? Questions of community, questions of resilience. For persons in religious traditions, it's their religious communities, churches, etc. So what does communal life look like in response? So that really the key is to say to theology students, you're responsible for these texts and religious practices in ways that other people aren't necessarily, but that they count on you to think about the claims of the tradition alongside the phenomenon of trauma. So with that, I'll launch into my presentation. Before the term trauma infused our contemporary landscape, Simone Weil provided a description of the phenomenon under another name, affliction. Writing in the 1930s and 40s, Weil depicted affliction via the image of an inaudible cry. Affliction is by its nature inarticulate. Even if through his stammerings he should utter a cry to pierce the soul, neither the magistrate nor the public will hear it. His cry is mute. Two questions sound from this cry. So this is an inarticulate cry, right, of which two questions emerge. The first is, why am I being hurt? The second, why are things the way they are? To understand affliction or trauma, you need to hold the two questions together. The first suggests a particularity in individual suffering, and in the second, the scope widens to the societal. Weil's eye was on the effects of modern industrialization. Interestingly, that Dr. Crawford brought that up, is the phenomenon of industrialized countries. Her eye was on the effects of the modern industrialization on the human person. Reflecting on what happens to the worker on the factory line, Weil writes, the belt, the lamps, the belts, the noise, the hard, cold iron work all converge toward the transmutation of man into workman. Things play the role of men, men the role of things. Therein lies the root of the evil. There is psychic suffering, but the suffering is linked to wider social and political realities. So her diagnosis of the human condition required her to kind of look at factory work conditions. What is society doing to the person? Her writings are really difficult to categorize, and she's identified in many places as a social theorist, a theologian, a mystic, a political activist, and a philosopher. And she drew on the writings and theories of all of these arenas to diagnose the human condition. We could say that she's a forerunner in the interdisciplinary study of trauma. Philosophy, history, psychology, political theory, and theology all are invited, in Kathy Kruth's words, to gather around the enigma of suffering for the truth that it speaks. Interestingly, in Weil's notion, it speaks, but the question is, who can hear? Weil was deeply moved by the spiritual writings of the various religious traditions, and she read widely the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, the Christian Gospels, the Gnostic texts, Egyptian mysteries. She found in these traditions larger frameworks in which to interpret human suffering. While modern society isolates the individual, sacred stories pulled individuals into a cosmic narrative. The conditions of suffering extended beyond the individual to the universal. For her, the harm done to one reverberates across creation. Reading her theological and political writings together, we can witness her quest to address these two questions. Why am I being hurt? And why are things the way they are? Her interest in religion was not for the sake of religion itself. In fact, she had a very contentious relationship with institutional religion. But her interest in religion was for its potential to speak to the condition of affliction. So it was like religions offer a lot of things. It was like a beeline for what it says about the human condition under modern industrial conditions. So it was the message of the least of these, for instance, in the Christian tradition, that she deployed to argue that persons can't be turned into things, right? That's where the deployment of a certain message in the spiritual texts really motivated her. So 75 years since Vey wrote, the modern industrialized society has given way to our globalized society. She recalls in her childhood the return of World War I soldiers. And now we face the challenges of caring for veterans from the long stretch of our 21st century wars. As a theologian, my work shifted significantly when military chaplains started to show up in my courses, many times between deployments. So these are people for whom the military gave a kind of the gift of education between deployments, which meant they're coming off very intense tours of duty. My engagement with veterans grew out of my awareness that religious communities needed to more actively respond to the challenges of reintegrating veterans back into civilian society following these wars, knowing that the VA was going to be kind of overloaded and that many of the veterans were never going to seek VA services at all. Warriors Journey Home, a group located near Akron, Ohio, provided one model of how veteran care was done. And that group was co-led by a native ceremonial healer in the Seneca tradition and a Protestant minister, himself a non-combat veteran. Both have degrees in counseling and psychotherapy, and I could talk a little bit about how the group came to formation, but we don't have a lot of time. So one of the distinctive aspects of this group is that civilians are involved. So in this veterans circle or in these veterans meetings, that often it's just the social worker, the clinician, and the veterans. This group incorporates civilians, which they call strong hearts. So you can see here that I started to be interested in this group through my relationship with Reverend Schloop, who was one of the leaders. And then I actually went through their facilitator training. So I thought I was just going to go do interviews, and then I became very moved, actually, by what was happening there. And what happened is I went to interview the caregivers, the two leaders, and the veterans. So I kind of went with my IRB proposal, and I thought it was like my first IRB, and I was like real psyched to do these interviews. And what I found out was what was more compelling to me was the experience of the civilians in the group. So my IRB kind of took a turn because the fact is that civilian participation was unique, but I found that civilians were experiencing just very profound things by their participation in this group, and their participation in this group was deeply affecting how veterans perceived societal invitation and welcome back into society. So there's a strong sense of a we in this group. We send our soldiers off to fight, and it's our responsibility to vigilantly wait and to reintegrate them back into society. So they're called strong hearts because it takes persons of strong heart to wait and hold the stories, to wait for service members to come home, and also to hold the stories of war when veterans return home. So these represented, I did 10 interviews, they represent sisters of veterans, sisters, wives, lay leaders in the church, and even one Vietnam-era man who struggled with his non-participation in the war. So you can imagine he didn't go to fight. It was a very complicated story, and I didn't really ever get the story. I just thought his struggle and his shame is his non-participation in the war. So I really focused my interviews here, and I'm just sharing with you a piece of what emerged from there. They follow a circle process in which participants form a circle at the center of which is a talking stick and objects that have become sacred to that group in their process. Dog tags of former members, burning sage, candles, it changes as the group involvement changes. The mantra of the circle is listen, speak, and heal. And the rituals and stories of earth medicine and Christianity provide a container in which the stories of war are told and received. Interestingly, in this group, there's a hell of a lot of silence. So often when we think of circle process and people talking, often you can go to a circle and really nobody speaks, right? So it's not like, okay, everybody, let's go around the circle and tell your story. It's that the stories come when the stories come, and the stories may not come. So what really provides the fuel for the group and the sense that the participants have of it being sacred is the rituals. They're always the same every week. The timing of the circle every week. So there's not an unexpectedness to the actual ritual and process. It's very a kind of synchronized, non-chaotic, I keep calling it a container, and I think that's a nice way to express it. In asking questions about whether they see what they're doing as religious or spiritual, of course I'm a theologian, right? So I've got to ask them, like, do you see what you're doing as religious or spiritual? Several use the language of spiritual but not religious to describe what happens in the circle. But those categories really seem to be irrelevant to these participants. I think this is interesting. When I tried to parse out the interplay of terms such as Earth Mother, Holy Spirit, Creator God, the witness of the ancestors, I mean, these terms are flying around in every session. When I tried to parse out, well, kind of what do those terms mean to you, one person explained, I don't care where the healing comes from, I just know it when I feel it. So it's clear to me that the circle did several things, but it formed community. But what I didn't expect was how the sacred framing that John and Cheyenne offered gave participants the sense that the work of healing that they were engaged in was actually not their individual healing, but it was actually a part of the healing of the whole world. Like there's a very strong cosmic sense that what they were about and what they were doing was not just about one veteran's suffering, but that they were actually participating in the healing of all the world and actually of civilization. And some of that framing came from Cheyenne Eagleheart's, a lot of her conversation about the witness of the ancestors and the kind of cosmic narrative that she infused. So for many people who came in there thinking, I've got PTSD, that kind of disease language or pathology shed when they thought there's an interconnectedness of suffering in the world. And I'm not only part of experience that harm, I'm actually called to be a healer. So that I think is really, really profound. That container provided a kind of cosmic space. Cheyenne speaks about the gifts that her tradition brings to the work of healing. So Cheyenne's the facilitator. She herself is a survivor of abuse in residential schools, and she simultaneously holds the traumatic history of her peoples and the trauma of recent wars together. So I asked her at one point, Cheyenne, how can you offer healing gifts to the people whose ancestors abused your peoples? And she answered in a way that links Simone Weil's two questions. She said, hurt goes to hurt. She said, when I look into the eyes of the veteran, I see the hurt and I know it. So the practice of looking into each other's eyes that happens in the clearing round of the circle process enacts this. The eyes become a portal into the soul, as it were, and they use a lot of soul language. We can talk about that. It creates a channel across which suffering flows, hurt to hurt, suggesting that pain travels across experiences, so much so that civilian members began to speak about their own healing process from wounds that had nothing to do with war. One strong heart said, I discovered in the circle process the reason why my marriage ended. So the cosmic vision of interconnectedness of suffering, signaled also by the vocabulary of the communion of saints or the community of the ancestors, is similar to the vision that is provided in Ve. The harm done to one reverberates across creation, and all witness to the pain and all participate in the healing process. But Cheyenne took my question further. There will come a time, she said, when our healing process will require that they hear and contend with those histories, the histories of their ancestors. As a healer, she's tapped into the direct line of pain that connects humans in the midst of their suffering, and yet healing work involves justice. There's a cosmic vision of responsibility and, might we say, of reckoning, like a day of contending with the histories of the peoples. So individual hurt and yet the greater histories of injustice sit alongside each other in this healing work. So I'm making the case for the importance of the big cosmic container that sacred stories can provide. Universal religious visions are powerful, and they're employed for harm and for healing. So while the container of ritual and sacred storying is central to the practices of healing for these veterans, these same universal religious visions fuel violence, fuel terror in the name of God. So I tell my theology students, your sacred stories go both ways, and it's your job to track their use. The work of theology, as I see it, is not to support religious claims at all costs, but to continually examine the religious texts and practices attuned to how they are deployed. So this is what I think the theological offers to the study of trauma, a kind of commitment to say, oh yeah, we're going to go at those religious texts, but because they're interpreted in such different ways, right? For harm and for healing. So there's no kind of their terrible texts or their great and redemptive texts, we can talk about that word, but that actually they're both. And so theologians are kind of tracking how they're used. So I've been also tracking the emergence of spirituality, the term spirituality, particularly within the military, because it's now part of the comprehensive soldier fitness wheel. So this recognition that spirituality is a dimension of wounding and healing, I think, is a really important one. But I also worry that spirituality, as it's appearing, may stop short of probing the why question at the heart of Ve's analysis of affliction. Spirituality can also often be rendered in individual, privatized, and increasingly commodified forms. So Ve's questions turn the study of trauma into really a multi-layered process of analysis. So we need to ask whether spirituality turns us toward or away from some of the systemic questions at the root of the question, why are things as they are? So as we offer resources for people to be more resilient in their communities, thinking about your talk, are we equally attending to the conditions of the factory line, right? So for Ve, you got to ask what's happening to the person in the factory line. So in our case, we need to keep asking about the realities of our ongoing militarization and its effects, not just dealing with vets when they come home, but persistently asking what kind of nation are we? And the veterans are really asking those questions too. Why did I fight? Was it worth it? That's part of the journey of coming home. So in closing, the veterans in Warriors Journey Home really are talking about their hard work of returning from war. So when other members look into their eyes, they're opening a portal for the wound, as if to expose it to open air. And Cheyenne describes the work of healing as a long and painful process, like a process of rebirth or resurrection. Many of the people she works with live, she says, with razors lodged deep within them. And they've been there so long that the razors have been there so long that they don't even know or see that they're there anymore. It's too painful to remove them. But as a healer, Cheyenne says, I slowly help them to dislodge the razors. And I know that the doves come after the razors and that they're being set free. So a vision for healing, I'm slow on my slides here. So this image of the doves and the razors that Cheyenne narrated, a vision for healing, the work of the community, is to really transfigure a term that's deeply important in the Christian tradition, mostly in the Eastern tradition, to transfigure the wounds. So I asked Cheyenne, so where did you get that image of the doves and the razors? She said, somewhere in my tradition, or maybe it's kind of a riff on my tradition. She said it's somewhere in the stories. And I think a lot of the work of theology is to providing people not a reinforcement of their traditions, but these important riffs on the stories, leveraging them to think differently about redemptive trajectories and employing our sacred stories towards more healing ends. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rambo. Dr. Stephen Sandage is the Albert and Jesse Danielson Professor of Pastoral Psychology and Theology at Boston University and the Director of the Research Center at the Danielson Institute. He is co-author of 3 books, To Forgive is Human, The Faces of Forgiveness, Searching for Wholeness and Salvation, and Transforming Spirituality, Integrating Theology and Psychology. He also has a book forthcoming through APA, Forgiveness and Relational Spirituality. Dr. Sandage has also authored articles and chapters in areas such as forgiveness and related virtues, hope, humility, gratitude, social justice. Some of these things he has already, in his first year at the Danielson Institute, brought many of us on board to his projects in a way that's been exciting and enlightening and really opening things up for us. He is a licensed psychologist, practices at the Danielson, also supervises, provides seminar leadership in couples and family therapy, which is another of his specializations. He also specializes in multicultural therapy, spiritually integrative therapy, and has 20 years of clinical experience. He provides diversity consultation and training to leaders in education, business, therapy, and ministry. He is a reason for gratitude every day that I come to work, and a big part of the creativeness and energy of this conference. Dr. Sandage.
So I'm going to briefly say a couple things about research findings, which I know is what you're all really excited about at this point in the afternoon on the edge of your seat. But first I want to explain that probably over the last 10 years as a practitioner, most of my applied work has been doing couples therapy and diversity training. And I don't know if those seem implicitly related to you, but I realized at some point that I was basically doing the same stuff doing couples therapy as I was doing diversity training. That it really is about how human beings handle the anxiety of difference, open their mind and hearts to the realities of difference in non-judgmental ways, get centered and grounded to deal with their anxieties and the traumas actually that do come sometimes as we have our differences collide. And I started doing a lot of that, working particularly with highly religious folks in a university where I was teaching, training therapists, spiritual leaders, doing diversity training in that setting, among some folks who sometimes, as Dr. Helms pointed out, are kind of wary of differences and sort of enjoy homogeneity. And so that was really challenging me to think about how are spirituality and something like intercultural competence potentially integrated? And the idea I'd briefly like to nominate is that I think potentially integrating spirituality and intercultural competence could serve some degree of trauma prevention. I'm not suggesting that it will somehow eliminate all trauma, but at the interpersonal level, at the communal level, to the extent we've heard all day, to the extent that people really cannot handle the anxiety of difference, to the extent that people are caught up in oppressive structures of society that we go along with or are oblivious to, that enacts further trauma. I've also found, though, working with public school teachers for 4 years in Minneapolis, in a very large school district where I got to work with hundreds of educational leaders in diversity training, very secular milieu, that it was interesting how when in that environment, as you're trying to do diversity training, two things really stood out. That the process of dealing with those issues is more like therapy than what most of us probably think of as education. In other words, a lot of diversity training follows this kind of model of you sit in a workshop like this for hours and you listen to people and then you walk out the door. And actually these issues are loaded enough, sometimes laced with trauma, that I think there's a different kind of relational experience that's actually needed. The second issue I noticed, again, in that sort of secular milieu, is that when we actually got into relational groups and experiences and affect started to come online, that people's ultimate values and concerns started to come online, even though we weren't in a religious context. What people really believed ultimately about the world and what they valued the most was terribly important to the diversity work. So that's the backdrop, and I'm going to just briefly tell you about some of the research we've been doing, and then we're going to have a conversation. So there's lots of definitions of spirituality. The framework that a colleague, Laurent Schultz, and I have written about is a relational view of spirituality, where spirituality is defined as ways people relate to the sacred. So it's broadly speaking, looking in relational terms at how people relate to God or the sacred, whatever they consider sacred. And of course, it's the same brain that we use to interpret people that we would use to interpret the sacred. So it's not surprising from an attachment perspective, from a neurobiological perspective, that there's often parallels between how people relate to the sacred and how they relate to other people, both for better and for worse. Some of our research has focused particularly on spirituality and what we could call alterity, or ways of relating to otherness. This is a beautiful quote by Elie Wiesel, that it's my caring for the otherness of the other that determines my humanity and my spirituality, and raises the idea that perhaps spirituality could serve towards moving towards mature alterity, mature otherness. And that's a complex subject I won't take a lot of time on, except to note that in our latest thinking, we believe at the minimum, intercultural and more broadly diversity competence should be part of that, and also a commitment to social justice should be part of that. And in some of the empirical studies we've done, actually both those factors are positively correlated with humility as a personal trait of how one looks at oneself in the world, and also with differentiation of self, which again I think bumps into the trauma topic in interesting ways, because several people have noted how trauma can make our brain functioning, our emotional experience, even our political orientation quite undifferentiated, quite totalizing. And so there's probably something at the psychological level that's necessary in terms of a greater differentiation. So I've framed some of the questions that we've been interested in. How are various forms of religion and spirituality, and I don't mean like Buddhist versus Christian versus Jewish, I mean ways people relate to their spirituality. How are those related to individual differences in styles of alterity? And do some ways of relating to the sacred actually inhibit growth in mature alterity? And can spiritually sensitive diversity training help prevent trauma and aid treatment? We don't know that for sure yet, but that's the question. So one of the tools that we've used in training and in research is the Intercultural Development Inventory. It's a pretty sophisticated assessment tool to tease out different ways people orient towards cultural difference. The developmental model behind this tool would have a lot of points of rapprochement, Dr. Helms, with your racial identity model. It's not the same, but it's really more about ethnic, cultural differences. But a sophisticated tool that's not correlated with impression management and has very good psychometrics. What it teases out, in short, is several different intercultural orientations. There's several other sub-styles, but I'm kind of painting in broad strokes here. That some people orient towards cultural differences in a very polarizing way, as being aware of cultural differences, but very much oriented towards some groups being better and others being worse. And of course, that will lead to problems in intercultural relations. Some people orient towards intercultural differences through minimization, which would sort of correspond to some of those middle schemas in Dr. Helms's model, that there's not usually tremendous conscious defensiveness, but there's a glossing over of cultural differences, and maybe talking at a certain level about valuing differences, but then in practice not really being engaged in that. Actually, for those from non-dominant groups in the United States, minimization is actually quite an achievement, you could say, because it's sort of assimilating into mainstream society, since most of U.S. society operates off minimization. But of course, there's things lost in the process of that sort of assimilation. And a downside for the person, for folks like myself that are dominant group members, to continue to operate in minimization as part of maintaining social privilege and not acknowledging difference. In this model, those who would function at the level of intercultural competence have found a way to balance an openness to difference, an interest, along with an ability to actually work within cultural differences, and are less preoccupied with who's better, who's worse, one up, one down relating. So through a series of studies, and these studies I'm talking about are with samples of Christian graduate students in the helping professions, where I used to teach in Minnesota, we've started to see factors spiritually that correlate negatively and positively with intercultural competence, to tease out this question: might it be that some people's ways of relating to the sacred are actually inhibitory towards healthy alterity, while other ways of relating to the sacred are more salutary for this? And so on the right side, we see that questing's a measure of people's valuing of existential questions as part of their faith, a kind of openness to rethinking things. Obviously, some people see this a part of their religious faith. There's a little bit of data to suggest some people who've been traumatized become existential questers. They are really value-seeking and exploring. Though some people who've been traumatized do not. They have kind of a capsule around their worldview, and it doesn't feel safe to explore. But this suggests that part of intercultural competence among spiritual or religious people probably needs to involve valuing, rethinking things, questioning things, wondering about things. I already mentioned a couple of the other effects. Gratitude, a sense of appreciativeness, which can be part of many religious traditions, but we could find many folks in religious traditions who are not oriented towards gratitude, but gratitude looks like a psychological and spiritual stance that's quite consistent with intercultural competence. We've used a measure of meditative prayer, which is interesting in terms of what a number of the presenters have raised. This is a less wordy, more relational form of being in the presence of the sacred. Some people that are highly religious really have no tools in this. They have no training when they go to pray. It's very wordy, it's listing requests. They just don't have skills in how to engage their spirituality in a way that would be helpful in this regard. Perhaps helpful both for trauma recovery as well as relating to others. And then in kind of wrapping up, I'm going to mention two factors that we've studied in some depth, spiritual factors that are very disconducive to intercultural competence and to relating well across diversity. One is a variable called spiritual instability, which comes from a scale based on object relations and attachment theories Folks who score high in this scale have a lot of emotional dysregulation in relation to the sacred. It really reflects borderline personality traits as a style of relating to the sacred. A lot of internal splitting, fear of abandonment spiritually, and likely introduced via trauma. So one of the impacts of trauma that Dr. Rambo kind of alluded to is that trauma could potentially shift my relational templates towards the sacred in ways that will not be helpful to me, not only in terms of mental health, not only in terms of spiritual well-being, but actually might get in the way of me relating well across diversity. There's just too much anxiety about differentness. So these are some of the items from that scale that reflect, for the folks in these studies, a strong fear of abandonment, a strong internalization of shame, too much preoccupation about the self to perhaps reflect on the self the way Dr. van der Kolk described. And more broadly, research has suggested that this style of relational spirituality is correlated with a lot of stuff that isn't helpful for people in their development. And so clinically, one of the things that's interesting, though, is if someone is very committed to their religious and spiritual faith, but they relate to it in this way, can you really do therapy or clinical work without somehow engaging the sacred? That's one question that I think is rather interesting. At some point, at some time, isn't it going to be necessary to get into that realm? Not to tell people what to believe or tell them go to a different congregation, or not to just sort of get directive, but to somehow create some experiential elements, some relational experience that could shift their templates about the sacred. Different kind of problem, but some similar outcomes for folks who score high in a measure of spiritual grandiosity. This is a narcissistic way of relating to the sacred. And kind of some fun items there. These are folks who perceive their relationship with the sacred to endow them with special privileges and to be, a bit above others. And, a lot of us around the room are laughing about that. If we got really honest about, have any of us ever been there at some point in our own journey, maybe in adolescence, maybe at another point where a powerful spiritual experience just felt like it lifted us a little bit above others. However this scale is, so there can be some of that is not totally uncommon, but folks who score really high in this chronically, and this is from a sample of people in their mid-30s, we're talking about something that isn't just sort of an adolescent phase, potentially. It's potentially something more chronic. And the challenge for this group is these are people that don't feel bad. The people high in spiritual instability, they know they're struggling. They may not agree with you why, but they know they're struggling. You can see they're struggling. These people, by self-report, are not struggling. Heinz Kohut used the term for narcissism of a vertical split in their psyche. And by that he meant there is a kind of covering over their underlying dysregulation that sort of encapsulates it. And we could wonder how many folks high in this have been traumatized and they found a particular means of coping that sort of encapsulates it, and it's partly around their perceptions about the sacred. So perhaps not terribly surprising that this scale also negatively correlates with intercultural competence. There's not a lot of openness to difference. We actually haven't published it yet, but we did a pre-post study in a multicultural graduate counseling course and found that spiritual grandiosity was negatively related to change in the course, that students grew in their intercultural competence over the course overall, but this factor was almost like an immunity to change factor. And I think it does, it's going to require more thinking for those of us interested in these populations. And so what would be the inroads? Is it possible that for some folks just sending them to diversity training or certain kinds of psychotherapy won't really do it, that there may need to be some particular ways to try to penetrate that well-constructed spiritual set of defenses. So, well, I look forward to our panel discussion. So thank you. We'll take some questions here in a few minutes, but it'd be interesting to hear what stood out to the three of you today.
One of the things that stood out to me, and it was reinforced, I knew it before, is that there was a big convergence of many of the different presentations today, including the last four, that it's almost that you see it in reverse as opposed to going forward. And it reminds me of an analogous process in life that, you know, life is sort of it's to be lived forward and understood backwards. So as we talked about many of these different things, to see how from different angles we sort of chipped away at the same questions and trying to have an understanding, yet, you know, in a bigger sense, you know, in my more practical view of things, the real answer still eludes me, but we're working at it and we're nibbling on it from a lot of different ways.
I wanted to, I was really interested in Dr. Khan sharing about the kind of differences in practice that you invited in the things that were important to your community, which is the prayers or the texts, and had to kind of work at integrating that with the kind of professional training that you had. And it struck me that it was an interesting connection to how do you think about cultural competency in terms of who teaches you to do that kind of integration, which is you're not just going in with the whole, like, the toolbox, you got it, you go in, here's your community, but who trains you to work with what's important to the communities that you're serving. And that just struck me as such a powerful connection that a lot of it's troubleshooting, right? That I work with a lot of people whose theologies are really problematic for me, right? It's just like I have to do some deep breathing and to say, wow, like how can you function in the world if you think God is punishing you like that, or that God is going to punish other people like that? And the kind of what it takes to get you to work with what are these very impassioned topics and deep beliefs. They're not even beliefs, they're affective. Like they're not kind of propositional claims that people have. They're, I mean, judging from growing up in a religious tradition, they're like part of the way that I move in the world. So they're not just my beliefs and my system. It's like I'm in my gut evangelical. Like whether or not I left that tradition, you know, 30 years ago, when people start saying certain language or moving in certain ways, I'm like, oh, those are my people, right? So that what you're dealing with is the body, the affect, and what people bring you requires a kind of toolkit that's like involves systemic analysis of why injustice occurs, and race and class, which is, I think, an under-named dimension of the kind of work that all of us do. But I just was like struck by the toolkit is when you're, as an educator, you know, how do you, I mean, you seem like a miracle in your setting to be able to kind of, like, I'm going to work with what my community brings me, and I'm going to somehow integrate. Does that just happen by people who are really good at what they do, or is there some training that's possible?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking of the fact that how the safety and essentialism, I think we are used to looking at things in a very essentialistic, simplistic way, and there's so much more complexity that's out there and how things get defined when it comes to multiculturalism. That are
Yeah, collar.
Is it better?
I think collar's in the way.
I was thinking of like how to move away from that essential way of thinking, and I think it comes from exposure partly.
You're going to have to control your clothing.
You're right.
And I think challenging and questioning the simplicity, because it's easy to go with binary oppositions. I think those are so prevalent in our social, political, ideological structures that the ways of thinking of what's right and wrong, what's dark and light, and gender, and all these ways that are binary, and we tend to then think that one is better than the other, and the role of oppressor and oppressed comes into play and gives us a reason to dominate. And how do we deconstruct these ways and structures that surround us? And how do we go to that place? And it comes from a place, for me at least, of having experienced being the oppressed in that setting. Like, why is it that it's thought of in this way? And wanting to understand and look beyond that. So I think then finding theoretical ways of making sense of that and seeing these things around you and starting to deconstruct those things and sort of apply it to your own work and recognize that whatever is stated is not it, there's more to it, whether it comes with language or cultural ways of being. If I just adhere to the Eurocentric models of like how to work with pathology or how to make sense of people, it would be limiting. And how do I go beyond that? And what are the different possibilities and how do you entertain? And sort of the openness to that comes from a place of having been there in the oppressed form.
I think I am coming away struck at the incredible number of different disciplines and maybe, I don't like this term exactly, but levels of analysis. I mean, the embodied level, the socio-political level we've heard about, the systemic level, the theological level, the psychological. There really are a lot of different levels or angles into some common issues. And in some ways I find that quite hopeful, actually, that there are a lot of pathways into dealing with these issues. Now, how to encourage enough of that and keep the sustained effort and to coordinate. I mean, that's what's kind of encouraging about being together today from some different disciplines and some different angles, is to potentially collaborate more.
And I think that is a real opportunity. I mean, as in your presentation, and you talked about intercultural competence, I mean, we've been working around notions of cultural competence for a long time, almost so long that I've just about given up. And the reason for that is because, you know, there's only so much you can get out of a concept. And I ran into significant barriers. When I think about competence, I think about capability across a number of areas, and if you put culture in there, sort of the products of all human thought, work, institutions, that is really big. I mean, you know, really, am I even competent in my own culture? And then I looked at the question of the big eight, the so-called big eight of diversity, and let me see if I can get the eight. So there's race, ethnicity, age, disability status, religion, economic, gender, and gender identity. So there are 8, but if you just dealt with the 8 alone, there are over 40,000 permutations that theoretically I would have to be competent in all of those to be able just to work with the 8. And that doesn't even deal with the intersections with those things. So as you were presenting, I was thinking, well, you know, maybe this sort of religious or spiritual direction is one way that we can sort of, you know, corral some of these things to really push it forward, rather than where we seem to be at a dead end right now in a lot of the consideration, a lot of the thought, a lot of the discussion.
Yeah.
Those 8, it seems like the religious part is often left out. And it was nice to see that brought in, because in the psychological realms, other places you go, you hear all about other aspects of identity, but the religious realm is often not talked about. So it was exciting to see that be a part of it in such a prevalent way.
Well, let's take some questions or thoughts from the audience. I think we're quite ready.
I'm probably oversimplifying by, God only knows what factor, but do you ever just sit with people and say, tell me who you are?
What do you think, we're psychologists or something?
I know, I'm sorry, but I see lots of people who aren't like me in any way. And a lot of them are very young. I specialize in seeing children, but I do the intakes with their parents, and I may say to them, tell me what you do every day, or I may say to the kid, and it seems to get around a lot of these very complicated things. And it also saves me a hell of a lot of embarrassment, because then I don't have to show them how much I don't know. But maybe that's too simple. Maybe I need to raise more issues overtly and more actively. What do you think?
I think a lot of times, I think it's important for the person in front of me that I hear her or his narrative. And I've got to try to understand, even if I were speaking with another black male of Southern African American heritage, it doesn't mean that we're anything alike other than maybe some shared aspects that we may not even identify with to be able to connect with the other person. So at least from my standpoint, I like to get the information to really understand how the worldview of other people, the types of experiences they've had that have honed that worldview, how they see me and how they relate to me. Because after everything is said and done, we can talk about all the random controlled trials on the different methods. But when it comes down to that person in front of you, which I find myself arguing a lot, I'm on an Institute of Medicine committee on quality measurement and also an APA committee on the development of clinical treatment standards, that it still boils down to that one person in front of you to try to connect with that person and engage that person in the best, most effective way possible. So I just say hear to what you say. And I'll try to keep working it out that way.
That's the one finding that seems to keep holding up is the quality of the relationship over all of the other EBTs.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, we gotta get Philippe's coming, yeah.
Yeah, hi, thank you. So I guess what I'm curious to hear about is the issue of traumas that are experienced within communities that are based upon the ways in which people within a community try to police the boundaries of that community. So for example, I was thinking about what Dr. Helms was talking about white identity development and the anxiety that whites feel. And I think that often what's missed is that it's not me they're worried about each other. Because the violence that they experience is within their community to conform to particular ideas. But the idea is that they're worried about everybody else. And so I'm wondering about that issue of within group policing of boundaries and all of the violence that's necessary to force groups of people to conform to the systems that you guys have been talking about. So I just wondered if you could comment on that.
I think it's an excellent point. I'm glad you raised that in a lot of the conservative religious folks I've worked with as clients, there is a tremendous, you could say that there's a tremendous in-group kin altruism, conformity dynamic that's trying to hold a community together. That would be the kind of strengths-based way of putting it. But when there's a ton of anxiety and rigidity and control, it can also be oppressive. But the way I heard what you raised is that there is this pressure to kind of maintain boundaries, which are excluding. And that in and of itself, apart from diversity, ends up doing a lot of damage to people within the community, particularly to women. And it's challenging if there is no open door to connecting with a mental health system. I mean, I've had clients who their family system, they did homeschool, home medicine, home church, and wouldn't even think of like going to a shrink. So if you're a kid who grows up in that kind of system, you know, where do you get to connect with any larger social system? One of my clients actually, they put her in public school for a year, and the teacher got suspicious about what was going on at home, and they pulled her back to homeschool. So that is a powerful way those systems work to out of exclusion, and it's traumatizing.
If I could just add one more thing to that too, and I'm thinking about it. You know, I think about what gets people together. You know, how can we all get together? And the only idea I have was from a movie that I saw. I don't know, it may have been an Academy Award nominee. It was called Mars Attacks. And I was thinking if we were attacked by Martians, you know, then it's like everybody got together. There was no color, there was no gender. We were just trying to survive from the Martians. So, what was that? Yeah, I mean, to me, I think that would be a wonderful public health intervention in one way for those who survived. You know, like Dr. Strozer this morning was talking about those that survived the apocalypse. But the other thing that I thought about is that, you know, short of something like that happening, there are always going to be differences, and Dr. Sandage, I think, had it right in saying that. But it's easy for me to bomb a village in a plane from 40,000 feet. It's a lot more difficult for me to be on the ground and stab someone with a bayonet or throw a grenade. So I think that part of the bridges that needed to be built are the ones that we have to reach out individually and try to connect with people to challenge in a gentle, appropriate, accommodating way, not to run them away, but to be sufficiently assertive. The limited and inflexible beliefs they had, I mean, sort of like I was thinking about with Dr. Sandage's spiritual grandiosity. I mean, you want to try to break through that, but you also can't do it in a way that runs them away and reinforces the limitations of thought and of experience and of engagement that they had. So I think there's a lot of work to do, but a lot of that work first is done with ourselves before we can really do work with them.
I think the idea of differences within similarities is a very common one. I'm thinking of just the work that I do at the different mosques. They're all Muslims, but each mosque has its own composition. Different ethnicities, different languages, who goes to which mosque, which groups collaborate together. A mosque that has Moroccans or Jordanians or Pakistanis or Bangladesh, they're all going to different places and they have their own way of thinking, and we don't often think of those differences. And I think it's because we think of the group in general and we don't think of differences within, and those are quite prevalent.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for a great panel. Coming from my context in Indonesia, I've become more aware about the importance of trauma as interreligious discourse, and therefore I'm particularly thankful to Dr. Khan and Dr. Rambo. And looking at trauma as embodied experience from within that context, if you have two women, Muslim and Christian, in the aftermath of violence, and you ask them to encourage them to pray, and the Muslim woman just cannot bend down because it's too traumatic for her, and for the Christian woman cannot close her eyes because it's just traumatic for her in remembrance of those trauma. And how can you start to build a trusting process for these two women looking at trauma as interreligious practice? Thank you.
You're right about the fact that, you know, I think it alters, many women who I work with who come from refugee camps, it alters their sense of relationship with their God and what it means to be bending in front of God, and what it means to be following those rituals in multiple ways. Physically, how they're holding it versus how they're making sense of this deity who's bigger, how they identify with that. And a lot of the work has been about what they think about the religious part that is healing for them, letting them bring that to you. I've had women who want to then first time, there are two women that I work with particularly who did not want to pray for a while because they were angry at God after what had happened to them. And what it would mean to heal that relationship with God and how that applies and parallels how those relationships between her and other people were managed. And what are the steps that they could take to address that? What parts of the religion were still sacred for them, and going that route. I can talk about women who have picked parts of the Quran and want to talk about surahs that are healing and stories that appeal to them as the Prophet's wife, and what they could apply to themselves and start that route. But you're right that that relationship gets altered, and it's a working through of that process. That's challenging, but I think many of them don't even bring that to the fore unless they know that the person whom they're working with will be able to understand, comprehend, and relate to that part.
I'm going to actually point out that Septemi Lakawa is the one who asked the question, and she could answer much better than we could. She wrote a whole dissertation on this, so she's practicing humility and not highlighting her own research. But I think it's really important to, when you think about conflict areas, I was part of a travel seminar that went to the Middle East, and this question of how do you tell both narratives, both a kind of Israeli-Palestinian narrative, how do you deal with both of those conflicting narratives? And I think what's interesting is, and Mark Gopin has done really good work on this, is he started studying people like you, Septemi, who are working in these areas, many times women. The men are talking about the peace and the women are making the peace. Like some of that's true, I think. But the people who are doing decades-long sustained peace-building work, like Mark Gopin started to say, what fuels these people? Like instead of asking like, okay, how can we solve these grand policies? He wanted to say, what's the kind of spiritual juice that keeps people in these, that fuels peace builders over decades when they often see intractable conflict with no positive end, right? He's like, that's where we should be studying, like these people, and we should follow them around because they're healers and they never get the credit. So I'm kind of saying for people like you, the question I think coming from the spiritual realm is what sustains you in the work that you do, to really start studying people who have, I think, a capacious spirit. Like what allows some people when they experience conflict to shut down and never want to go outside of their community? And then what enables people like you who, and it's bodily, like you open yourself up to say, I'm going to engage the other, right? What's the difference between those two people? And some of it's resources, like, they've experienced love and kindness, and so they're going to extend. I think Mark Gopin's onto something. We got to start looking at these people and saying, they're long-term marathoners in peace building, and we could learn a lot from them. So I just want to give a shout out to the work that you do, because I think you have more answers than we do about that kind of interreligious practices of hospitality, which is really, they're practices, they're relational, and you're doing them. So you should be answering them.
I was sort of startled by your contrast between Haiti and Fukushima, or Sendai, and calling one thing I thought resilient, the other one not. And to me, these two cultures really exemplify a very complex issue. Namely, I was in Sendai and Fukushima quite a bit at that time, and I was astounded by the passivity of the Japanese population and their authority structure, making it impossible for them to move, and the slowness of the help effort. I was really appalled by the slowness of the help effort. But people also were very communal and very supportive of each other on the ground, and they were waiting for other people to intervene. Haiti, where I've not been to, but I've spoken to many people who have been there, including people from my crew, there's a lot of activity, a lot of energy, but not a lot of rebuilding. And just because people in Japan kill themselves, to my mind, doesn't mean that they were less resilient than the people in Haiti. I think the culture made for very different adaptations. And powerful adaptations that we as outsiders can barely touch. Because the culture is so powerful, and as an outsider, you can just say a few things that may change awareness just a little bit, but in the end, it's their culture.
I'm sorry if I gave the impression that the Japanese were not resilient.
Yeah.
Because if you look at the core components of resilience, including collaboration, communication, problem solving, all those things are there. I see culture as a moderating variable. You know, again, mediators sort of explain, moderators change and affect. And the moderation aspect of that, if you looked at it between trauma and recovery, I see that in the Haiti part being, they're both being adaptations. In Japanese, as you said, who are, as a culture, and I don't want to sound stereotypical, but as a culture, are typically patient and willing to wait for gratification, and also wait for an authority figure to come, an authority person in authority to come. Whereas the Haitians just sort of, in their cultural adaptation, just adapt. And the interesting thing is that folks were making a living off of this. And also, if you look at some of the pictures related to before and after, before even looks worse than after. So I think you're absolutely right. I was just drawing the connection between the kind of personal population impact of stress related to suicidality, as opposed to suicidality, assuming that reported cases are there in the Haitian case, which may or may not be the case, and not looking at other indicators like maybe increases in aggression or homicide or assault and those types of things.
Very likely,
but that's one, but that's one indication, right?
But the aggression that comes after trauma is a very big issue, because this is hyperarousal that needs to be gotten rid of somehow.
So we're going to need to turn things over to Dr. George Stavros for some final comments.
Well, we're at the end of our day. I became aware in having the opportunity to do some of the introductions that in the midst of a conference that is trying to address questions that run the risk of leading towards conclusions that there isn't much that can be done, that we're in the midst not only of our speakers and our panelists, who are people who have put themselves in the midst of trauma in order to figure out what can be done, but I also want to acknowledge that we probably could have made introductions for almost all of you in the room to talk about what you're doing to figure out what can be done to alleviate suffering and mediate the effects of trauma. This, to me, is a privilege to be in a room where so many people have committed their vocational lives to such an endeavor. That's a big deal. If we could imagine another one of Dr. Vander Kolk's slides of a collective brain that was barely lit up before the conference started, it would be shining a little brighter right now. And that's good news. And I think maybe in identifying with the kind of suffering that we're talking about and standing in the spaces that it creates and trying to figure out what can be done, we're doing what can be done. So I want to thank all of you, especially want to thank our speakers and our panelists. I want to thank the staff of the Danielson Institute, Lauren Keogh and Sarah Hassan, for all their hard work putting together the conference. And I hope you all keep checking your email when there's a byline from the Danielson Institute, because we'll be inviting you back for future events. Thank you very much.